World War II was not only a global military conflict, but also a dark turning point for medical ethics and human rights. Under the pressure of war, ideology, and dehumanization, several governments sanctioned or ignored horrific human experimentation. These experiments, often carried out on prisoners of war, civilians, and marginalized groups, caused immense suffering and death. They violated every principle of medical ethics and ultimately reshaped international law and medical standards after the war. This article examines the most terrifying experiments conducted during World War II, focusing primarily on Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, where such practices were systematic and state-supported. 1. Nazi human experimentation. Nazi medical experiments were driven by racist ideology, military ambition, and pseudoscientific beliefs. Victims were often Jews, Roma, disabled individuals, Soviet prisoners of war, and others considered undesirable. 1.1 Hypothermia Experiments Location. Dachau concentration camp. Purpose: to determine how long German pilots could survive in icy waters after being shot down. Prisoners were submerged in freezing water or left naked outdoors in sub-zero temperatures. Doctors measured how long it took for body temperature to drop and tested rewarming methods, many of which were lethal. Victims suffered extreme pain, organ failure, and cardiac arrest. Hundreds died during or shortly after the experiments. Survivors were often permanently disabled. 1.2 High-altitude experiments location. Dachau. Purpose: to simulate high-altitude conditions faced by Luftwaffe pilots. Prisoners were placed in low-pressure chambers that replicated altitudes up to 68,000 feet. Subjects experienced embolisms, brain damage, ruptured lungs, and seizures. Many died screaming as their organs failed. Autopsies were often performed immediately after death. 1.3 Infectious disease experiments. Diseases tested: malaria, typhus, tuberculosis, hepatitis. Prisoners were deliberately infected to test vaccines and drugs. Subjects endured high fevers, hallucinations, and prolonged agony. Many were denied treatment to observe the full progression of disease. Thousands died or were executed after experiments ended. 1.4 Sterilization and genetic experiments. Driven by Nazi eugenics ideology, doctors sought ways to sterilize entire populations quickly. Methods included X-ray exposure to reproductive organs, injection of toxic chemicals into uteruses, surgical mutilation without anesthesia. Victims often suffered severe burns, infections, permanent infertility. Death 2. Unit 731, Japan's Biological Warfare Program. The most notorious Japanese war crimes occurred under Unit 731, a covert biological and chemical weapons research unit of the Imperial Japanese Army. 2.1 Vivisection without anesthesia location, Manchuria, occupied China. Victims: Chinese civilians, Korean prisoners, Soviet POWs prisoners, were dissected alive to study the effects of disease on organs. No anesthesia was used to avoid interference with results. Organs were removed systematically while victims were conscious. Subjects were killed once experiments concluded. 2.2 Biological Weapon Testing Unit 731 Weaponized diseases, such as bubonic plague, anthrax, cholera. Experiments included releasing infected fleas into villages, contaminating water supplies, observing population-wide outbreaks. These actions caused tens of thousands of civilian deaths, far beyond the laboratory. 2.3 Frostbite experiments. Prisoners' limbs were frozen in ice or exposed to extreme cold until the flesh hardened. Doctors tested rewarming techniques, including boiling water, fire exposure, amputation, limbs often blackened, rotted, or detached entirely. 3. Experiments on prisoners of war. Both Axis powers conducted experiments on POWs. 3.1 Chemical weapons testing prisoners were exposed to mustard gas, phosgene. Lewisite effects included blindness, severe burns, lung damage, slow, painful deaths. Survivors often lived with lifelong disabilities. 4. The aftermath and legacy. 4.1 War crimes trials. Nuremberg doctors trial, 1946 to 1947. 23 Nazi doctors were tried, 7 were executed. Many Japanese scientists from Unit 731 were never prosecuted, as the United States granted immunity in exchange for research data. 4.2. The Nuremberg Code. As a direct response to these atrocities, the Nuremberg Code was established, forming the foundation of modern medical ethics. Key principles include voluntary informed consent, avoidance of unnecessary suffering, the right of subjects to withdraw. Experiments must benefit society. Conclusion. The terrifying experiments of World War II represent one of the darkest chapters in human history. Conducted under the guise of science and military necessity, they revealed how easily morality can collapse when ideology and power strip people of their humanity. Remembering these atrocities is essential, not only to honor the victims, but to ensure that science, medicine, and governments never again abandon ethical responsibility in pursuit of progress. While Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan conducted the most systematic and extreme human experimentation, they were not the only nations to cross ethical boundaries during World War II. Other powers, including the Allied nations, also carried out controversial experiments, though on a far smaller scale, and usually without the explicit intent to kill. Understanding these actions is essential for a complete historical record and for recognizing how war pressures can erode moral judgment across all sides. 5. Allied human experiments. During World War II, although Allied experiments did not approach the brutality or scale of Nazi and Japanese crimes, some practices still violated informed consent and caused lasting harm. 5.1 Chemical exposure experiments. Countries involved: United States, United Kingdom, Canada. Purpose: to test the effects of chemical weapons and protective equipment. Thousands of soldiers were exposed to chemicals such as mustard gas, nitrogen mustard, lewisite. Often, participants were not fully informed of the risks. Consequences included severe skin burns, permanent lung damage, increased cancer risk later in life, psychological trauma. Many veterans were sworn to secrecy and denied medical recognition or compensation for decades. 5.2 Radiation and medical testing. Some soldiers and hospital patients were subjected to experimental vaccines, radiation exposure, new drugs with unknown side effects. These experiments were usually justified as necessary for national defense, but informed consent was frequently absent or incomplete. 6. Experiments on civilians and occupied populations. Beyond laboratories and camps, civilians often became unwilling test subjects. 6.1 Starvation studies. In occupied territories and prison camps, authorities deliberately restricted food supplies to study human endurance. Victims suffered muscle wasting, organ failure, and mental breakdowns. Starvation experiments influenced post-war nutritional science, but at an enormous human cost. A notable example is the Minnesota starvation experiment, 1944 to 1945, conducted ethically by modern standards but inspired partly by wartime famine observations. 6.2 Psychological experiments. Extreme isolation, sleep deprivation, and sensory manipulation were sometimes tested on prisoners. Effects included hallucinations, memory loss, emotional collapse, long-term mental illness. These studies laid groundwork for later interrogation techniques, many of which remain controversial today. 7. Why these experiments were possible. Understanding how these atrocities occurred is as important as knowing what happened. 7.1 Dehumanization victims were labeled as subhuman, enemies of the state, disposable resources. Once stripped of identity, ethical restraints vanished. 7.2 Abuse of science and authority. Doctors and scientists swore loyalty to regimes instead of patients, manipulated scientific language to justify cruelty, valued data over human life. This distorted view of science turned healing professions into instruments of torture. 7.3 War as moral cover. War created urgency, we must win at any cost. Secrecy reduced accountability. Under these conditions, crimes were easily hidden or rationalized. 8. Long-term consequences for survivors. Survivors of wartime experimentation lived with lifelong consequences. Physical effects, chronic pain, infertility, blindness, amputations, neurological damage, psychological effects, severe PTSD, depression, and anxiety. Survivors' guilt, social isolation. Many survivors were never compensated or formally acknowledged. 9. Ethical lessons for the modern world. World War II fundamentally reshaped global ethics in medicine and science. 9.1 Creation of global standards. In addition to the Nuremberg Code, other safeguards emerged. Declaration of Helsinki Institutional Review Boards, IRBS, informed consent laws. These exist because people once had none. 9.2 Ongoing relevance. Modern debates involving genetic engineering, human trials in developing nations, artificial intelligence, military research, all trace their ethical roots back to the failures of World War II-era science. Conclusion: expanded. The terrifying experiments of World War II remind humanity that scientific progress without ethics is not progress at all. These crimes were not committed by monsters alone, but by educated professionals who abandoned their moral responsibilities under pressure, ideology, and ambition. Remembering this history is not about assigning eternal blame. It is about ensuring that never again is more than just a phrase. This section focuses on the individual doctors, scientists, and commanders who designed and carried out these experiments, as well as the moral collapse of professional medicine during wartime. Understanding the people behind the atrocities reveals how ordinary professionals became perpetrators of extraordinary cruelty. 10.1 Josef Mengele, the Angel of Death affiliation, SS physician, Auschwitz-Birkenau. Focus: genetics, twins, racial purity. Josef Mengele is perhaps the most infamous Nazi doctor. He conducted experiments primarily on twins, children, and people with physical differences. His experiments included injecting chemicals into children's eyes to attempt to change eye color, infecting one twin with disease and killing both to compare organs, performing amputations and surgeries without anesthesia, killing subjects by lethal injection to conduct autopsies. Victims described Mengele as calm, polite, and meticulous, an unsettling reminder that evil does not always appear monstrous. Mengele escaped justice after the war and lived freely in South America until his death in 1979. 10.2 Sigmund Rascher, high altitude and hypothermia. Experiments affiliation, SS doctor, Dachau. Concentration camp. Rascher conducted some of the deadliest experiments of the Nazi regime. Prisoners were exposed to simulated altitudes causing brain hemorrhages. Victims froze to death while doctors observed their final moments. Children were murdered to study rapid blood clotting. Even by Nazi standards, Rascher was considered brutal. He was later executed by the SS, not for his crimes against prisoners, but for fraud and personal betrayal. 10.3 Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician role, head of the Nazi euthanasia program, Action T4. Brandt oversaw the systematic murder of disabled individuals, falsely labeling it as medical mercy. Tens of thousands were killed via gas chambers and lethal injections. Victims included children with disabilities. Doctors signed falsified death certificates. Brandt was convicted at the Nuremberg doctors' trial and executed in 1948. 11. Unit 731, The Scientists of Biological Horror. 11.1 Shiro Ishii, architect of Unit 731. Affiliation: Imperial Japanese Army. Role: Commander of Unit 731. Ishii believed biological warfare could win wars cheaply and efficiently. Under his command, prisoners were infected with plague, cholera, and anthrax. Humans were used to test grenades, flamethrowers, and bombs. Pregnant women were infected to observe fetal transmission of disease. Ishii and many of his colleagues received immunity from prosecution after the war in exchange for their data, a decision still debated by historians and ethicists. 11.2 The Culture of Silence and Denial. For decades after the war, Unit 731 crimes were omitted from Japanese textbooks. Survivors were ignored or silenced. Official apologies were delayed or avoided. This prolonged denial deepened the suffering of victims and obstructed historical accountability. 12. Victim testimonies, voices from the darkness. Survivor accounts provide the most powerful evidence of these crimes. 12.1 Auschwitz survivors, former prisoners described, being lined up and selected like objects, children taken away and never returned. Endless fear of medical blocks. One survivor recalled, "The doctors did not look at us as humans. We were material." 12.2 Chinese civilian testimonies, villagers near Unit 731 sites described, sudden outbreaks of plague, entire families dying within days, bodies burned to destroy evidence. Many survivors still suffer from chronic illness linked to biological exposure. 13. Why justice was incomplete. Despite war crimes trials, many perpetrators escaped punishment. Reasons included Cold War politics, desire for scientific data, national embarrassment, lack of survivor documentation. This selective justice remains one of the most controversial legacies of World War II. 14. Modern recognition and memorialization. In recent decades, museums and memorials have been established. Testimonies have been recorded before survivors pass away. International scholars have re-examined wartime ethics. Education now plays a key role in preventing repetition. Conclusion, Part 3. The terrifying experiments of World War II were not the work of madness alone, but of educated professionals who chose obedience over ethics. Doctors trained to heal instead caused unimaginable suffering, proving that knowledge without morality can become a weapon. Their victims were not statistics. They were people whose lives were stolen in the name of false science. This section examines what happened after the war, how survivors were treated, how governments responded, and how the world struggled, and often failed, to confront the full truth of these crimes. 15. Survivor compensation and official responses. 15.1 Nazi experiment. Survivors after World War II, many survivors of Nazi medical experiments found that survival did not mean justice. Compensation programs were slow and limited. Many victims were required to provide documentation that had been destroyed. Psychological trauma was often dismissed or misunderstood. Germany eventually established reparation programs, but thousands of survivors died before receiving any compensation. Even decades later, survivors described feeling forgotten by the world that once promised never again. 15.2 Victims of Unit 731. Survivors of Japanese biological experiments faced even greater obstacles. The Japanese government denied legal responsibility for many years. Victims received no official compensation. Medical records were destroyed or classified. Many Chinese survivors were left with chronic illness, genetic damage passed to children, social stigma within their communities. To this day, no comprehensive international compensation program exists for Unit 731 victims. 16. Government silence and historical suppression. 16.1 Political convenience. Following the war, emerging Cold War tensions reshaped priorities. The United States and Soviet Union sought scientific advantages. War crimes investigations were sometimes halted for strategic gain. Biological warfare data was secretly absorbed into military research programs. This meant that truth was sacrificed for power, leaving victims without closure. 16.2 Educational gaps. For decades, school textbooks minimized or ignored medical war crimes. Survivors' stories were excluded from official narratives. Public awareness remained limited outside academic circles. Only in recent years has broader education begun addressing these topics honestly. 17. Psychological impact. Across generations. 17.1 Intergenerational trauma. Children and grandchildren of survivors often experienced anxiety disorders, depression, nightmares, and emotional detachment, fear of authority or medical institutions. Trauma did not end with the victims. It echoed across generations. 17.2 Distrust in medicine. In communities affected by wartime experiments, hospitals were feared rather than trusted. Doctors were seen as instruments of power. Participation in medical research declined sharply. This legacy continues to affect public health efforts today. 18. Ethical failures that still matter. World War II is often treated as a closed chapter, but its ethical lessons remain unresolved. Warning signs that still exist: dehumanizing language toward groups, national security used to override human rights, scientific secrecy without oversight, ends justify the means thinking. These patterns are not historical, they are recurring. 19. Why remembering is a moral responsibility. Remembering these experiments is not about guilt. It is about accountability and prevention. When societies forget, victims are erased a second time. Crimes become easier to repeat, ethics weaken under pressure. Memory is one of the strongest defenses against future abuse. Conclusion, Part 4. The aftermath of World War II experiments reveals a painful truth. Ending the war did not end the suffering. Survivors faced silence, denial, and neglect long after the world moved on. Justice was partial. Apologies were delayed. Many voices were never heard. Yet telling these stories, fully and honestly, is an act of respect for those who were treated as expendable. Their suffering reshaped medical ethics, international law, and human rights protections that still safeguard lives today. The exposure of wartime human experimentation shocked the global community and forced a reckoning within science and medicine. From this reckoning emerged new ethical frameworks designed to ensure that such atrocities could never happen again. These safeguards, now taken for granted, exist because of the immense suffering endured during World War II. 20. How World War II experiments changed modern medicine. 20.1. The birth of informed consent. Before World War II, medical experimentation was often conducted with little regard for patient autonomy. The Nuremberg Code, 1947, established for the first time that voluntary consent is absolutely essential. Participants must understand risks and benefits. Coercion invalidates consent. This principle is now the cornerstone of all ethical medical research. 20.2. Institutional oversight and accountability. Modern research is now regulated by ethics committees, institutional review boards, IRBs, independent monitoring agencies. Experiments must minimize harm, be scientifically necessary, stop immediately if risk outweighs benefit. These protections directly respond to World War II-era abuses. 20.3 Medical education reforms. Medical schools worldwide revise curricula to include bioethics, human rights law, patient-centered care. Students study World War II experiments not to sensationalize them, but to understand how ethical collapse occurs. 21. International law and human rights. 21.1. Crimes against humanity. The trials following World War II established that medical experimentation can be a war crime. Following orders is not a defense. Scientists and doctors are personally accountable. These principles influenced the Geneva Conventions, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. 22. Ethical dilemmas that persist today. Despite progress, ethical challenges remain. Modern areas of concern: genetic editing, CRISPR, military-funded research testing in economically vulnerable regions, artificial intelligence in warfare. Each raises the same question faced during